Hi everyone, as we continue with the endocrine system, this presentation is going to be about the thyroid gland that is influenced by the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. The thyroid gland, like the name says, it's going to be a gland that's going to be located anterior to the trachea. So this is your trachea right over here, and this is your thyroid gland. Now notice how it sits right under the thyroid cartilage. In addition, I want you to notice how it has a large anterior structure. However, when we look at it in a posterior view, it does not go around. So there's only a lateral part of the thyroid gland and an anterior part of the thyroid gland, but there is no posterior part of the thyroid gland. And this is the same thing for the thyroid cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage runs anteriorly and lateral, but it does not run posteriorly. Now the thyroid gland will be stimulated by the hormone that's secreted from the anterior pituitary, but before, the hypothalamus is the one that will secrete the thyrotropin releasing hormone that will then go all the way to the anterior pituitary, and this will cause the secretion of the thyroid stimulating hormone, which can also be called thyrotropin hormone, that will then go through the blood vessels and act directly on the thyroid gland and regulate the activity of the thyroid gland. The thyroid stimulating hormone, like the name says, it will stimulate the thyroid gland, more specifically the thyroid follicle cells, to produce two different hormones. And these are the triiodothyronine, or T3, and thyroxine, or T4. These hormones, they are often referred to as the metabolic hormones because their levels are going to influence the body's basal metabolic rate. What is the basal metabolic rate? Well, it's going to be the amount of energy that's used by the body when it's at rest. And so when T3 and T4 bind to intracellular receptors located on the mitochondria, they will cause an increase in nutrient breakdown and the use of oxygen to produce ATP. In addition, T3 and T4, they will initiate the transcription of genes that are going to be involved in glucose oxidation. And although these mechanisms, they will prompt cells to produce more ATP, the process is not enough. And an abnormally increased level of heat is going to be released as a byproduct of these reactions. And this so-called calorogenic effect is going to raise the body temperature. Now, adequate levels of thyroid hormones are also going to be required for protein synthesis and for the fetal and childhood tissue development and growth. And they're going to be especially critical for normal development of the nervous system, both in utero and in early development childhood. And they will continue to support neurological functions in adult. And as we noted earlier, these thyroid hormones, they have a very complex interrelationship with the reproductive hormones, and deficiencies can influence libido, fertility, and other aspects of the reproductive system. And finally, the thyroid hormones, they are going to increase the body's sensitivity to catecholamines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, by upregulating the receptors in the blood vessels. So when levels of T3 and T4 hormones are excessive, you have too many of them, this effect is going to accelerate the heart rate, it's going to strengthen the heartbeat, and it's going to increase blood pressure. And because the thyroid hormones regulate metabolism, heat production, protein synthesis, and many other body functions, there are several thyroid disorders that can have severe and widespread consequences, as you can imagine. The most common diseases which you might have heard of are hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. Hyper, like the name says, is going to be an overactive thyroid gland, so it's going to be producing too much thyroid hormone, and hypothyroidism is the opposite, so it's going to be an underactive thyroid gland, therefore it will not produce enough thyroid hormones. Now, hyperthyroidism is usually more common than hyperthyroidism, and although the two conditions they have very different signs and symptoms, sometimes their symptoms can overlap, so it might be a little bit hard for you to distinguish which one you have. So it's important to do some blood work to check the levels of the thyroid hormone to see if you have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. With regards to the symptoms, with hyperthyroidism, you may find yourself with more energy and experience weight loss as opposed to weight gain, and you may also feel anxious. And hypothyroidism would be the opposite, so it causes symptoms like slowed metabolism, fatigue, and weight gain. And having an underactive thyroid can also decrease or slow down your bodily functions. So it's important, if you have any of these symptoms, to get checked and make sure that everything is okay. In this slide, we're going to see how the thyroid hormone synthesis is regulated. Mainly, you're going to check for the levels of T3 and T4 in the blood. If you have low levels, this will cause the hypothalamus to release the thyrotropin releasing hormone. Once the hypothalamus releases this hormone, it will trigger the anterior pituitary to secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will stimulate the thyroid gland, more specifically the thyroid follicle cells, to release T3 and T4. T3 and T4 will cause several effects. The two main ones are the increased basal metabolic rate of the body and also a rise in body temperature due to this calorogenic effect. Then when you have too much T3 and T4 circulating in the body, this will cause a negative feedback loop, which will then inhibit the hypothalamus by preventing it from releasing the thyrotropin releasing hormone, and this will therefore stop the anterior pituitary from producing the thyroid stimulating hormone. And that's how you control the levels of T3 and T4 in the body. The thyroid gland also secretes another hormone which is called calcitonin. And this hormone is going to be secreted by a different group of cells which are called parafollicular cells, and they can also be called C cells. Now, why is this hormone released? Mainly it's released when you have too much calcium circulating in your blood. Therefore, you want to remove the excess calcium in the blood. And how do you do this? Well, there are a few ways that you can do it. First, you can inhibit the function of the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are these cells right over here. And what do? They work on resorption of bone. In other words, the osteoclasts, they're going to chew up the bone to remodel the bone. So when they chew up, they break down the bone and they release the calcium into the blood. So if you want to decrease the calcium levels, then you need to make sure that you inhibit the activity of the osteoclasts. And then on the opposite end, you want to increase the activity of the osteoblasts, which are the cells that will build the bone. So when you're building bone, you need to have calcium to be able to build the bone and deposit the bone matrix. Therefore, you're removing the calcium from the blood to be able to build more bone. So by increasing the osteoblast activity, this will remove the calcium or the excess calcium from the blood. In addition, you can prevent or decrease the absorption of calcium by the intestines. So by doing that, you remove the calcium from the body. And one way to do that is by increasing the loss of calcium in the urine. So you reduce the absorption by the intestines and you remove the excess calcium through the urine. So all these are ways in which calcitonin will help to reduce the amount of calcium that's circulating in the blood. Next, let's talk about the parathyroid glands, which are these tiny round structures that are usually found on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. Now, most people do have 4 parathyroid glands, but occasionally there are some that have more parathyroid glands located in other places like the neck or the chest. Now, as we can see over here, there are 2 different types of parathyroid cells, and these are the oxyphil cells and the parathyroid or chief cells. The oxyphil cells, we don't really know the function of these cells, but the parathyroid cells or the chief cells are the ones that will produce the parathyroid hormone. And when do we have the release of parathyroid hormone? It will be the opposite of the calcitonin. So this will be in response to low levels of blood calcium. So the chief cells will be responsible, together with the calcitonin, for calcium homeostasis. So what do we want to do? We want to increase the calcium levels. So we're going to do the opposite of what was happening with the calcitonin. We're going to stimulate the osteoclast activities because we want the osteoclast to chew the bone and make the calcium available in the blood. And then we want to inhibit the osteoblastic activity because when you have osteoblastic activity, the osteoblasts use the calcium up to build bone. But if we have low levels of blood calcium, we want to have the calcium available in the blood. Therefore, we don't want to be building bones. We want to preserve the calcium that's available in blood circulation. This diagram is a great diagram to show us the calcium homeostasis with regards to the functions of the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. Let's start right over here. So if we have low levels of calcium concentration, this will stimulate the parathyroid glands, which are these small, tiny little glands over here. More specifically, the chief cells of the parathyroid glands to release the parathyroid hormone. What will this do? It will inhibit osteoblast activity and stimulate osteoclast activity. And by doing this, you're breaking down the bone and releasing calcium into the blood. The other thing that it will do is that the parathyroid hormone will have an effect on the kidney. What it will do is that it will stimulate the kidney, more specifically the tubule cells, to recover the waste calcium from the urine, and it will also release calcitriol. Now, calcitriol is going to be important because once it circulates into the blood, it will reach the digestive system. And what it will do there is that it will stimulate the intestines to absorb calcium from the digesting food. Therefore, you're holding up more calcium into the body. And this will increase the levels of calcium. If you have too much calcium, this will activate now your thyroid gland, more specifically the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, to release calcitonin, and calcitonin will have the opposite effect as the parathyroid hormone. So it will stimulate the osteoblasts and will inhibit the osteoclasts, and therefore the calcium is going to be removed from the blood, and it's going to be used to build bone, because when you're building bone, you're depositing, so you're removing that calcium from the blood, and then it goes back to normal levels. And this is another example of the negative feedback loop.